The silence on the parade deck was absolute, heavy with the salt-thick air of Coronado and the crushing heat of the midday sun. 300 sailors stood at rigid attention, their white uniforms blindingly bright, but every eye was locked on the podium. Admiral Sterling stepped down from the raised platform, his polished shoes crunching softly on the asphalt. He moved with the slow, predatory gait of a man who owned the very oxygen in the perimeter. He stopped inches from Elena's face. She stared straight ahead, her eyes fixed on the horizon line, her posture betraying nothing. "You think you belong here?" Sterling's voice was a low growl, barely audible to the formation but thundering in her ears. "You are a clerical error, a waste of my budget and a stain on my trident." Elena did not blink. "I am standing, Admiral. That is all the regulations require." The vein in Sterling's neck pulsed. He leaned in, invading her personal space, the smell of expensive cologne mixing with the stale odor of his coffee breath. "Regulations? I am the regulation." He stripped the medal from her chest, a commendation she had just been handed, and threw it on the ground. When she remained like a statue, the insult to his authority made him snap. His hand came up, fast and heavy, a backhand slap designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate. Thwack! The sound echoed off the concrete barracks like a gunshot. Elena's head turned slightly to the left. The silence that followed was terrifying. "Pick it up," Sterling hissed, raising his hand again. "And then get out of my—" The air shifted, the pressure dropped, and for the first time, Elena looked at him, really looked at him. 3 weeks earlier. Naval Amphibious Base Coronado. The bus smelled of diesel fumes, stale sweat, and the sharp, nervous anxiety of 40 men trying to look like they weren't afraid. Elena Vance sat in the back row, her knees pressed against the seat in front of her. She looked small. Intentionality was woven into every fiber of her posture. Shoulders hunched slightly forward, head down, eyes tracing the scuff marks on the floor. Outside the tinted windows, the gray concrete walls of the Naval Amphibious Base Coronado rolled by, blocking out the cheerful California sun. To the men around her, this was the gateway to glory, the entrance to the brotherhood of the United States Navy SEALs. To Elena, it was a crime scene. "All right, listen up, ladies." The shout came from the front, amplified by the confined space. A petty officer with a neck as thick as a tree trunk stood in the aisle. "From this moment on, you are nobody. You have no name, you have no rank, and you sure as hell have no rights. You are a recruit, and recruits are lower than whale shit." Elena didn't flinch at the volume. In her previous life, the real one she had locked away inside a mental vault, she had been screamed at by warlords in the Hindu Kush and interrogated by cartels in Juarez. A yelling instructor was ambient noise, but she forced herself to flinch. She widened her eyes, letting a flicker of manufactured panic cross her face as the instructor's gaze swept over her. He paused. His eyes narrowed as they landed on her frame. At 5'4", she was dwarfed by the corn-fed linebackers and former college athletes surrounding her. Well, the instructor sneered, stalking down the aisle. "What do we have here? Did the Girl Scouts bus take a wrong turn?" Laughter rippled through the bus, nervous and sycophantic. The recruits were eager to deflect the predator's attention away from themselves. "Name!" the instructor barked, looming over her. "Vance, Elena, Seaman Recruit," she replied, her voice soft, pitching it slightly higher than her natural register. "I can't hear you." "Seaman Recruit Vance," she shouted, cracking her voice just enough to sound desperate. You look like you're going to break in a stiff breeze, Vance, he spat, his face inches from hers. Do yourself a favor. Ring the bell before you get off this bus. Save the taxpayers the money of fixing you when you snap. I want to try, instructor, she stammered. Try? He laughed, a harsh, barking sound. There is no try here. There is only survival. And you're already dead. He turned and marched back to the front as the bus hissed to a halt. Get off my bus! Move, move, move! Chaos erupted. Elena was shoved into the aisle, bodies colliding, bags snagging. She stumbled intentionally, letting herself be jostled by a towering recruit from Arkansas who didn't even look down. As she stepped onto the scorching asphalt of the grinder, the heat hit her like a physical blow. The air was thick with salt and the roar of the Pacific Ocean nearby. But dominating the sensory overload was the presence on the chaotic parade deck. High above them, on a balcony overlooking the chaos, stood a figure in pristine white dress, watching the anthill scramble below. Even from this distance, Elena recognized the posture. Arrogant, rigid, Admiral Sterling. He was holding a coffee mug, looking down at the new batch of meat for his grinder. He was the king of this castle, the man whose negligence or malice had led to 2 body bags leaving this base in the dead of night. Elena adjusted her heavy duffel bag, feeling the familiar, comforting weight of her hidden mission. The instructor was right about one thing. Someone was going to break. Someone was going to snap. She looked up at the balcony for a split second, her eyes dark and unreadable, before quickly lowering her gaze back to the boots of the man in front of her. Enjoy your coffee, Admiral, she thought, her internal voice cold and sharp as a razor. It might be your last peaceful cup. Fall in, get on the line. Elena ran to the formation, disappearing into the sea of white t-shirts. The hunt had begun. The water in the combat training tank was a murky, over-chlorinated blue that stung the eyes even through goggles. Elena pushed off the wall for her final lap of the 500-yard swim. Her body wanted to cut through the water like a torpedo. Her muscles, honed by years of Tier 1 operations, screamed for speed. She had to fight her own efficiency more than the water itself. She forced her form to degrade slightly. She let her hips sink a fraction of an inch lower than optimal, increasing drag. She broke the rhythm of her combat side stroke, adding a chaotic splash to her kick that wasted energy. To the observers on the pool deck, she looked like a recruit running on fumes, fighting for every yard. Touching the wall, she surfaced, gasping for air. The gasp was theater, but the burning sensation of the chlorine was real. 12 minutes. 15 seconds, the timer shouted, looking at his stopwatch with a sneer. Cutting it close, Vance. My grandmother swims faster, and she's in a wheelchair. Elena dragged herself out of the pool, letting her arms shake as she grabbed her towel. She was well within the passing standard, but far from the elite times posted by the former college athletes who were currently high-fiving at the other end of the deck. She needed to be invisible, just another body in the pack, neither first nor last. Hit the grinder, push-ups in 5 minutes, move! The transition was brutal by design. Still wet and shivering in the coastal breeze, the recruits lined up on the asphalt. Elena dropped into the leaning rest position. The asphalt was hot, digging into her palms, contrasting sharply with the cold water dripping from her hair. The instructor from the bus, a man whose name tag read Miller, loomed over her. He didn't carry a clipboard. He carried a grudge. He squatted down, his face level with hers. "Let's see what you've got, Tiny," Miller muttered. down. Elena lowered her chest until it brushed the instructor's fist on the ground, then pushed back up. 1, Miller counted. She went down again. Up. 1. Elena paused at the top of the extension, her muscles locking. She looked at Miller. His expression was blank, daring her to challenge him. In the SEAL selection process, the instructor's count was God's law. If he said it didn't count, it didn't count. Down, Miller barked. Elena went down. Up. 1. Panic flared in the eyes of the recruit next to her, who was witnessing the sabotage. But Elena felt a cold, jagged shard of anger settle in her gut. This wasn't just hazing. It was a calculated removal. They were trying to zero her out before she even started. She adjusted her strategy. If she went at a normal pace, she would burn out before reaching the required minimum count of 50 if he kept stealing every second rep. She needed to double her output while making it look like a struggle. Elena accelerated. Her triceps pistoned. She threw her body weight into the movement, adding a theatrical tremble to her elbows on the lockout. 2, 3, 4. Miller began to count, unable to ignore the perfect form, though he still skipped every third rep. By the time Miller yelled, "Recover," Elena had done 80 push-ups to get credit for 52. She collapsed onto the asphalt, burying her face in her hands to hide not exhaustion, but the steady, regulated rhythm of her breathing. She shouldn't be winded, but she heaved her shoulders as if she were about to vomit. Pathetic, Miller spat, standing up and dusting off his knees. Barely made the cut. You're stealing oxygen from real sailors, Vance. The rest of the PST, sit-ups, and the 1.5-mile run followed the same pattern. She ran the miles in boots and long pants while others wore shorts, a self-imposed handicap to ensure her time remained mediocre. She crossed the finish line with a time of 10:58, stumbling dramatically as she passed the marker. From the shadow of the administration building, 100 yards away, Admiral Sterling lowered his binoculars. He turned to his aide, a young lieutenant with a nervous tick. "She passed?" Sterling asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "Yes, Admiral, by the skin of her teeth." Instructor Miller tried to freeze her out on the push-ups, but she persisted. Sterling hummed, a low, dangerous sound. He didn't like persistence. Persistence was a weed that grew through concrete cracks. It needed to be poisoned at the root. "She scrapes by," Sterling said, turning back to the air-conditioned sanctuary of his office. "That means she still has hope. Kill that. Tomorrow, put her on the frayed rope for the obstacle course, and tell Miller to stop playing games. I don't want her tired. I want her gone." On the grinder, Elena sat with her head between her knees, listening to the blood rush in her ears. She had survived day 1, but as she felt the weight of Sterling's gaze lift, she knew the real test hadn't even begun. The barracks at 0200 hours was a symphony of exhaustion. The air was thick with the humidity of 40 sleeping bodies and the smell of drying boots. Elena lay in her bunk, listening to the rhythm of the breathing around her. To any observer, she was deep in REM sleep, her chest rising and falling in slow, measured intervals. But under her eyelids, her pupils were dilated and alert. She waited for the roving patrol to pass the window. The beam of a flashlight swept across the ceiling, lingered for a second on the rows of bunks, and then moved on. The crunch of boots on gravel faded into the distance. Elena moved. She didn't just get out of bed. She flowed out of it. Her bare feet made no sound on the linoleum floor as she ghosted toward the rear exit. She was dressed in her black PT shorts and t-shirt, blending perfectly into the shadows of the unlit hallway. This was the domain of the Wraith. Getting out of the recruit barracks was child's play. The real challenge was the administration building, 300 yards across the open grinder. It was a blocky, imposing structure where Admiral Sterling kept his office, and more importantly, the base's archived personnel files. She stuck to the blind spots of the perimeter floodlights, timing her movements with the oscillating fans of the security cameras. She was not merely avoiding sight, she was exploiting the psychological gaps in the security design. Guards looked for movement, not stillness. Whenever the searchlight swept near, she froze against the dark brickwork, becoming part of the architecture. Reaching the service entrance of the admin building, Elena inspected the lock. It was a standard commercial pin tumbler, reinforced but mechanical. Electronic keypads were for the front. The janitorial staff used keys. From the waistband of her shorts, she produced a tension wrench and a rake she had fashioned from a discarded metal hair clip and a piece of wire found in the trash. 30 seconds later, the lock yielded with a soft, lubricated click. She slipped inside, closing the door before the latch could echo. The interior smelled of floor wax and stale coffee. Elena navigated by memory, having memorized the building's floor plan from a fleeting glance at a fire evacuation map 2 days prior. The records room was in the basement, a windowless tomb of filing cabinets and servers. She bypassed the digital keypad on the records door by sliding a shim through the gap in the frame to trigger the magnetic sensor from the inside, a trick that worked on older government installations. Inside, the hum of the server rack was deafening in the silence. She didn't touch the computer. Digital logs were too easy to track. She went for the physical, hard copy backups mandated by naval regulations. Her fingers walked across the tabs in the drawer marked Inactives 2023. She found them. Candidate Rodriguez, Candidate Miller, 2 women who had died in training within 6 months of each other. Elena pulled the files, using the hem of her shirt to avoid leaving fingerprints. She scanned the autopsy reports. On the surface, they looked standard. Accidental drowning. Hypoxia induced by panic. But as she held the paper up to the faint light of the emergency exit sign, she saw the inconsistencies. The texture of the paper on page 4 of Rodriguez's file was different. It was a replacement page. The alignment of the typewriter font was off by 1 millimeter compared to the header. She read the medical examiner's notes. The section detailing the condition of the rebreather gear had been heavily redacted with black marker, then photocopied to make the censorship permanent. But in the margin of the original carbon copy underneath, a faint, handwritten note had been missed. Valve diaphragm cut? Intentional? A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning ran down Elena's spine. This wasn't negligence. Someone had sabotaged the gear. Sterling wasn't just washing them out. He was executing them. Suddenly, the heavy thud of a door opening upstairs reverberated through the ventilation shaft. Heavy footsteps. Not a security guard's shuffle, but the confident stride of an officer. At Pseudo 30? Elena slid the files back. She had seen enough, but before she closed the drawer, she made a decision. A true ghost leaves no trace, but a hunter lays bait. She took the folder for Candidate Rodriguez and placed it back in the drawer, but she left it raised 1/2 inch higher than the others. It was a subtle imperfection. To a layman, it was sloppy filing. To a control freak like Admiral Sterling, who likely checked these files obsessively to ensure his crimes remained buried, it would be a screaming alarm bell. She needed him paranoid. Paranoia bred mistakes. Elena vanished back into the shadows just as the elevator dinged on the basement level. She slipped out the way she came, the cool night air hitting her face. As she sprinted silently back to the barracks, she wasn't just a recruit trying to survive Hell Week anymore. She was an operative building a case, and she had just touched the murder weapon. The obstacle course stood like a skeletal monument against the bleaching white sky of Coronado. It was a chaotic assembly of logs, ropes, and towering walls designed to break bones and spirits in equal measure. For Class 234, it was just another Tuesday. For Elena, it was the killing floor. Admiral Sterling stood on the observation deck of the tower, his silhouette cut sharp against the sun. He wasn't drinking coffee today. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. Since the early morning, he had been watching her specifically, his gaze tracking her movement with the intensity of a sniper scope. Elena felt the weight of his attention as she lined up at the start. "Vance, you're up!" Instructor Miller barked, his voice sounding tighter than usual. "Don't embarrass my Navy!" Elena sprinted. She hit the first obstacle, the log walk, with practiced fluidity. She moved not with the explosive, jerky power of the male recruits, but with a conservation of momentum that made her look slower than she actually was. She vaulted the dirty name logs, her boots finding traction on the polished wood where others slipped. Her breathing was controlled, a steady rhythm syncing with her stride. But as she approached the slide for life, a high-wire traverse that required recruits to shimmy across a cable suspended 20 feet in the air, her internal alarm bells began to ring. It wasn't a sound. It was a feeling, a prickle at the base of her neck that she had learned to trust in the mountains of Kandahar. She climbed the tower. The view from the top was dizzying, the safety mulch far below looking like a brown stain. She grabbed the cable. It felt standard. She began the traverse. Then she saw it. The transition bar at the far end, the metal pipe she had to grab to swing onto the descent platform, was wrong. The morning sun glinted off a thread of silver on the bolt securing the left side. The nut wasn't flush. It had been backed out, just enough so that the weight of a body swinging onto it would shear the bolt and send the recruit plummeting backward onto the concrete footing of the support pylon. A fall from this height, at that angle, meant a shattered spine. Elena didn't pause. Hesitation was suspicious. She continued her shimmy, her mind racing through calculations. She couldn't stop and point it out. They would call it equipment failure and fix it, and she would lose the element of surprise. She had to take the jump. As she reached the end of the cable, she prepared to swing. The standard technique required grabbing the center of the bar. Instead, Elena coiled her muscles and launched herself violently to the right. "What is she doing?" someone yelled from the ground. In midair, Elena bypassed the unstable horizontal bar entirely. She reached out and clamped her hands around the vertical support beam of the tower itself. The impact was brutal. The rough wood tore at her palms, and her shoulder wrenched in its socket with a sickening pop. Momentum slammed her body into the post, knocking the wind out of her. But she held on. She slid down the beam, her boots smoking against the wood, and landed in the mulch with a heavy thud. The bolt on the horizontal bar remained untouched. The trap had failed to spring. Silence descended on the course. The recruits stared. It was an ugly, unorthodox maneuver, completely against regulations, but she was alive. Elena stood up, rolling her shoulder to check for dislocation. It throbbed, but the joint was intact. She looked up. High above, on the tower, Admiral Sterling gripped the railing. Even from this distance, she could feel the heat of his fury. He had expected a medevac helicopter. Instead, he got a display of improvisation. "Vance!" Sterling's voice boomed from the loudspeaker system, distorting with feedback. "What was that garbage?" Elena stood at attention, dust coating her face. "I slipped, Admiral. Adjusted to ensure safety." "You violated safety protocol," Sterling announced, his voice echoing over the silent bass. "We train professionals, not circus monkeys. That stunt just cost your class 2 hours of log PT. And you, Vance? You run it again. Tonight. After chow. Until you learn to follow instructions." "Hoo-yah, Admiral!" Elena shouted back, her face a mask of obedience. She jogged back to the formation, ignoring the burning pain in her hands. The other recruits glared at her for the extra punishment she had earned them, but she didn't care. As she fell in line, she glanced back at the loose bolt. It was a message. Sterling wasn't just trying to wash her out anymore. He had moved to the endgame. He wanted her broken. If she wouldn't break, he would settle for dead. The combat training tank was a cavernous echo chamber of tiled walls and chlorinated water, smelling of bleach and fear. Drown-proofing was the great equalizer. It didn't matter how much iron a recruit could pump or how fast they could run. In the water, panic was the only weight that mattered. Elena stood at the edge of the deep end. Her wrists were bound behind her back with surgical tubing, tight enough to cut circulation but flexible enough to allow movement. Her ankles were similarly secured. She was, for all intents and purposes, a statue waiting to be thrown into the sea. "Into the drink, Vance!" Instructor Miller shouted, shoving her shoulder. Elena didn't resist. She toppled forward, breaking the surface with a minimal splash. The water accepted her. She sank to the bottom of the 12-foot pool, her feet touching the tile. She pushed off gently, rising to the surface for a breath, then exhaled and sank again. This was the rhythm. Bobbing, conserving energy, surviving. For the first 20 minutes, it was standard procedure. The recruits bobbed like apples in a barrel, eyes wide, struggling to keep their lungs full. Then came the harassment phase. Instructors dove in like sharks, spinning the recruits, holding them down, simulating the chaos of a surf zone entrapment. Elena felt a hand on her head. It was heavy, pressing down with malicious intent. She sank. She waited for the hand to release so she could surface. It didn't. 5 seconds passed, then 10, then 20. Usually, the instructor would dunk a recruit, watch them struggle and let them up before the panic set in. This was different. The hand on her crown was rigid. She was being pinned to the floor of the pool. Elena opened her eyes. Through the stinging blue haze, she saw the blurred legs of the instructor treading water above her. He wasn't playing a training game. He was holding her under. Her lungs began to burn. The carbon dioxide buildup triggered the diaphragm's spasmodic urge to inhale. The primal scream of the body demanding air. Panic knocked on the door of her mind, loud and violent. "Fight him," it screamed. "Headbutt his groin. Break the tubing. Survive." Elena shut the door. In the silence of the deep end, she retreated into the black box of her training. She remembered a damp cell in Eastern Europe, waterboarding sessions that lasted for days. She remembered learning that the fight for air burned oxygen twice as fast as the acceptance of suffocation. To survive, one had to embrace the drowning. She stopped moving entirely. She let her muscles go completely slack, hanging in the water like a corpse. She slowed her heart rate. a biofeedback technique she had spent years mastering, forcing her pulse down from a hammering 140 beats per minute to a hibernation-like 50. Above her, the instructor frowned. He could feel the lack of struggle. Usually, by this point, a recruit would be thrashing, desperate, clawing at the water. The stillness beneath his hand was unnatural. It was unnerving. Was she already unconscious? A shallow water blackout could kill in seconds. He held her for another 5 seconds, uncertainty creeping into his grip. If she died right here, with his hand on her head, even Sterling couldn't cover it up completely. The hand released. Elena didn't bolt for the surface. She allowed her natural buoyancy to lift her. She rose slowly, a dark shape ascending from the abyss. Her head broke the surface. She didn't gasp. She didn't cough or sputter water. She simply inhaled, a deep, efficient intake of air through her nose, and opened her eyes. She looked directly at Instructor Miller, who was treading water a few feet away, waiting to drag her out if she seized up. Water dripped from her lashes. Her expression was devoid of fear. It was devoid of anything human. It was the flat, predatory gaze of something that lived in the depths. "Problem, Instructor?" she asked. Her voice was calm, cutting through the echoes of the other recruits gasping and splashing. Miller paddled back, looking unsettled. He glanced up at the observation window where he knew the Admiral was watching. He had done his job. He had held her down past the breaking point, but she hadn't broken. "Keep bobbing, Vance," Miller muttered, swimming away faster than necessary. High above, behind the reinforced glass, Admiral Sterling watched the small figure in the pool resume her rhythmic descent. He tapped his ring against the glass. The file said she was a nobody from Ohio. The pool said she was a liar. Normal people didn't find peace in suffocation. "Check her background again," Sterling said to the empty room. "Dig deeper." Elena sank to the bottom, her feet touching the tile. In the silence, she smiled grimly. They were afraid of the water. They didn't know she had been born in it. The mess hall at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado was a deafening industrial cavern. The clatter of plastic trays hitting metal tables, the roar of industrial dishwashers, and the shouting of 300 famished sailors created a wall of white noise perfect for secrets. Elena moved through the line, her tray holding a pile of bland carbohydrates and gray meat. She wasn't hungry, but calorie intake was a mission requirement. Her eyes scanned the room, bypassing the rowdy tables of recruits reliving the day's trauma, and settled on the far corner near the exit. Sitting alone was Hospital Corpsman First Class Thorne. He was a man in his late 40s, his face etched with the kind of fatigue that sleep couldn't fix. He stared into his coffee cup, as if reading a grim fortune in the dregs. Thorne had signed the death certificates for candidates Rodriguez and Miller. Elena had seen his signature on the redacted files in the basement. She maneuvered through the crowded aisle, timing her movement to coincide with a group of instructors leaving their table. She slid into the seat diagonally across from Thorne, her back to the room. "Seat taken?" she asked, her voice low. Thorne didn't look up. "Free country, recruit, for now." Elena picked up her fork, stabbing at the potatoes. "You were at the pool today, Doc. You saw Miller hold me down." Thorne's hand tightened around his mug. "I saw a training exercise, standard drown-proofing." "You saw a homicide attempt," Elena corrected, her tone devoid of accusation, stating it as a cold fact. "Just like you saw with Rodriguez last winter." Thorne flinched. The coffee sloshed over the rim of his cup. He finally looked at her. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the yellow stain of chronic fear. He looked around nervously, checking the nearest tables. "You have a death wish, Vance," he hissed. "Keep that name out of your mouth. You don't know who's listening." "I know the autopsy report was faked," Elena said, leaning in slightly. "I know the rebreather didn't just fail. Someone helped it fail. And I know you're a good man who's been sleeping with the lights on for 6 months because you let them bury a murder." Thorne went pale. He opened his mouth to deny it, to tell her to get lost. But something in Elena's eyes stopped him. It wasn't the plea of a scared recruit. It was the command of an equal. She wasn't asking for help. She was offering him a chance at redemption. "They'll destroy you," Thorne whispered, his voice trembling. "Sterling. He has eyes everywhere. If I talk, I lose my pension. I lose my freedom. If you don't talk, you lose your soul," Elena countered. "And the next time a body bag leaves this base, the zipper will be loud enough to wake you up every night for the rest of your life." Thorne stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. The noise of the mess hall seemed to fade into the background. He looked down at his hands, scrubbed raw with antiseptic soap, but never feeling clean. Slowly, without looking at her, Thorne reached into the pocket of his cargo pants. He pulled out a small, crumpled paper napkin. Under the table, he slid it across the bench seat until it touched Elena's leg. "I kept it," he murmured, his voice barely audible. "I don't know why. Maybe I was waiting for someone who wouldn't break." He stood up abruptly, grabbing his tray. "Don't talk to me again, Vance. For both our sakes." Thorne walked away, disappearing into the scullery line without looking back. Elena waited a full minute before moving. She casually swept her hand over her lap, palming the napkin. Hidden within the folds was something hard and jagged. She finished her meal mechanically, then carried her tray to the disposal window. Only when she was safely in the stall of the female latrine did she unfold the napkin. Inside lay a piece of black rubber tubing about 2 inches long. It was a fragment of a regulator hose. One end was ragged, torn by force. The other end, however, told a different story. The cut was clean, precise, and angled. Elena ran her thumb over the smooth edge. No jagged tear, no material fatigue. This was a slice made by a razor-sharp blade, likely a serrated dive knife sawed gently to weaken the structure so it would blow out under pressure. It was a delayed action kill switch. She wrapped the fragment carefully in the plastic lining of a tampon wrapper and tucked it deep inside her boot. The cold confirmation settled in her chest. Sterling wasn't just a tyrant. He was a butcher. And now she carried the knife that could cut his throat. Hell Week was not a training schedule. It was a systematic dismantling of the human spirit. By Wednesday night, the concept of time had evaporated for Class 234. There was no day or night, only the binary existence of being wet or being sandy. Hallucinations were common. Men saw food trucks in the ocean or their mothers standing on the dunes. Elena's world had narrowed down to the rubber gunnel of the inflatable boat Small, IBS. She carried on her head and the heavy breathing of Boat Crew 7. They were running on zero sleep for 72 hours. Her neck muscles were knotted tight as steel cables, screaming under the weight of the boat, but her face remained a mask of grim determination. "Dump the boats! Surf torture! Move, move, move!" The command from the bullhorn cut through the fog of exhaustion. The recruits groaned, a low, animalistic sound, but obeyed. They dropped the boats and sprinted into the Pacific. The water temperature was 58 degrees Fahrenheit. It hit them like a sledgehammer, sucking the heat from their cores instantly. The class linked arms, sitting in the surf zone as the waves crashed over their heads. This was rocking chair formation. The goal was to induce mild hypothermia, pushing the body to the edge of shutting down. 10 minutes passed, then 20. One by one, the other boat crews were ordered out to the dunes to warm up. They huddled together, shivering violently, grateful for the reprieve. "Boat Crew 7, stay put!" Instructor Miller yelled, wading knee-deep into the wash. He pointed a flashlight beam directly at Elena's face. "You stay until Seaman Vance decides to quit. She's the reason you're freezing, gentlemen. She's the anchor dragging you down." The water was black and merciless. The man to Elena's left, a strapping petty officer named Davis, began to convulse. His teeth chattered with a sound like dice in a plastic cup. He was losing the battle. She doesn't belong," Davis stammered, his mind fraying. Ring the bell." Elena felt the tremor running through the line of linked arms. The cold was agonizing, 1,000 needles piercing her skin, but her mind was elsewhere. She was back in the mountains, buried under snow for a surveillance mission. She knew the cold. The cold was just a sensation. It couldn't kill you if you didn't let it inside your head. She tightened her grip on Davis's arm. Her hand was small, but her grip was iron. "Look at me," she whispered, her voice cutting through the roar of the surf. She didn't shout, she didn't plead, she commanded. Davis turned his head, his eyes glazed and wide. "The water doesn't know who we are," Elena said, locking eyes with him. "It doesn't care. Pain is just information, Davis. It tells you you're still alive. Squeeze my hand." Davis squeezed, weak at first, then harder. "Pass it down," Elena hissed. "Squeeze the hand next to you. We do not break. We do not ring." The signal traveled down the line of 6 shivering men, a pulse of defiance. They huddled tighter, drawing warmth from the friction of their wet uniforms. Instructor Miller watched from the dry sand, checking his watch, waiting for the inevitable break. He expected them to turn on her, to throw her out of the line to save themselves. Instead, the line solidified. 30 minutes, 40 minutes. The other crews were watching now from the dunes, silent. What was happening in the surf was unnatural. Boat Crew 7 should have been hypothermic casualties by now, but they sat there, a singular shivering organism, anchored by the smallest recruit in the center. Finally, a whistle blew from the darkness of the command truck. Even Sterling, watching from his heated cab, knew the limits of liability. If they stayed in another 5 minutes, hearts would stop. "Recover! Get out of the water!" Elena was the first to stand. Her legs were numb blocks of wood, but she forced them to move. She didn't run out. She walked, dragging Davis up with her. The crew stumbled onto the sand, blue-lipped and shaking violently, collapsing into a pile. Miller walked over, shining his light on them, looking for hatred in their eyes. He looked at Davis. "She almost killed you, Davis," Miller goaded. Davis looked up, wiping sand and snot from his face. He looked at Elena, who was already wringing out her shirt, her expression unreadable. She kept us warm, Instructor," Davis managed to say through chattering teeth. Elena didn't acknowledge the comment. She just stared at the ocean, her chest heaving slightly. She had turned Sterling's weapon against him. He wanted to use the cold to isolate her, but the cold had only forged the steel harder. Thursday of Hell Week brought a change in scenery, but no relief in misery. The class was marched to the Tijuana Sloughs, a vast expanse of tidal mud flats near the border. The stench was the first thing to hit them. a thick, sulfurous rot of decaying organic matter and stagnant salt water that coated the back of the throat like oil. The tide was out, leaving behind acres of gray, sucking mud. "Hit the mud! Low crawl! Keep your heads down!" Elena dropped to her stomach. The mud was cold and viscous, instantly soaking through her fatigues and filling her boots. It wasn't just dirt. It was a living, breathing entity that tried to pull you down. She began to crawl, digging her elbows into the slime to drag her body forward. The friction burns on her knees and forearms from the previous days were now raw, open wounds, stinging violently with every inch of progress. Class 234 looked less like men and more like primitive creatures emerging from the primordial soup. They were unrecognizable, coated head to toe in the gray sludge. But there was one spot of pristine white in the landscape. Admiral Sterling stood on the edge of the hard-packed sand, just a few feet from the crawling recruits. He wore his dress uniform cap, a bizarre and arrogant choice for the field, signaling that he had no intention of getting dirty. He held a megaphone in one gloved hand. He wasn't shouting at the group. He was tracking one specific recruit. "Vance." His voice crackled through the electronic distortion of the megaphone, loud and grating. "You look at home down there, crawling in the filth." Elena didn't pause. Her rhythm was mechanical. Left arm, right leg. Breathe. Right arm, left leg. Breathe. Sterling stepped closer, his polished shoes hovering dangerously near the edge of the muck. He walked alongside her as she crawled, looming over her like a judge at an execution. "Look at them, Vance," Sterling taunted, gesturing to the struggling men around her. "They are suffering because of you. They are dragging your dead weight. Do you have any honor? If you had a shred of dignity, you would ring that bell and let these men be sailors." The mud clogged Elena's ears, but Sterling's voice pierced through. It was designed to trigger shame, the most potent weapon in a commander's arsenal. He was attacking her identity, her worth as a teammate. "You are weak," Sterling hissed, lowering the megaphone so he could speak directly to her as she passed his feet. "You are small. You are a mistake." Elena stopped. Her hands were buried deep in the sludge. Her face was a mask of gray clay, only her eyes visible. She slowly lifted her head. The movement was not the defeated slump of a broken recruit. It was the slow, deliberate coil of a viper. She turned her neck and looked up at him. For a split second, the facade of seaman recruit Elena Vance evaporated. The exhaustion vanished from her eyes, replaced by a cold, absolute void. It was the gaze of the wraith, the look she gave a target through a scope before pulling the trigger. It promised violence. It promised an end. Sterling froze. His mouth opened to deliver another insult, but the words died in his throat. He felt a sudden, irrational spike of adrenaline, the kind a hiker feels when they realize the rock they are stepping on is actually a sleeping bear. The look wasn't defiant. Defiance implied emotion. This was an assessment. She was measuring the distance to his throat. The moment lasted less than a heartbeat. Elena blinked, and the recruit mask slid back into place. She lowered her head and resumed her crawl. Left arm, right leg. Breathe. Sterling took an involuntary step back, his heel sinking slightly into the soft sand. He lowered the megaphone, his hand trembling imperceptibly. He looked around, but the other instructors were busy yelling at the stragglers. No one else had seen the monster peek out from behind the girl's eyes. He watched her crawl away, disappearing into the gray mass of the formation. A cold sweat broke out on his forehead under the rim of his hat. He had come here to break a girl. He was starting to realize he might be poking a bomb. "Keep them out there," Sterling muttered to the nearest instructor, his voice lacking its usual thunder. "Another 2 hours." He turned and walked back to his vehicle, walking faster than usual, needing to put distance between himself and the mud. The wail of the sirens cut through the Friday night air, shattering the exhausted silence of the barracks. It wasn't the rhythmic klaxon of a fire drill. It was the dissonant, urgent warble of a force protection condition Delta exercise. "Lockdown! Everyone on the deck! This is not a drill! Security alert!" The doors of the barracks flew open, and masters-at-arms rushed in, flashlights blinding the recruits who were barely conscious after the horrors of Hell Week. Chaos erupted. But amidst the confusion of shouting men and barking dogs, Elena saw opportunity. Sterling was paranoid. The look she had given him in the mud flats had festered in his mind. He was shaking the tree to see what fell out, locking down the base to catch a phantom. He didn't realize that chaos was the natural habitat of a Tier 1 operator. While the other recruits scrambled to the floor, hands over their heads as ordered, Elena rolled under her bunk. In the dark crawl space near the wall, she pried loose a ventilation grate she had loosened on day 1. Behind it lay a small, waterproof pouch. Inside was a burst transmitter, a piece of tech no larger than a deck of cards, capable of compressing gigabytes of data into a sub-second radio pulse. She didn't stay under the bunk. As the MPs moved to the far end of the bay, checking IDs, Elena slipped out through the loosened grate into the subfloor maintenance crawl space. She emerged minutes later behind the generator shed, the cool night air hitting her face. The base was a flurry of activity. Searchlights swept the perimeter fences. Humvees with mounted machine guns patrolled the main roads. Sterling had turned Coronado into a fortress to find a single mouse. Elena looked up. The base water tower stood like a monolith against the stars, rising 200 feet above the flat terrain. It was the only point high enough to clear the electronic jamming interference Sterling had likely activated on the ground level. She began the climb. Her body was a wreck. Her hands were raw meat from the logs and the mud. Every rung of the maintenance ladder sent a jolt of fire through her shoulders. Her muscles, depleted of glycogen and rest, trembled violently. But she didn't stop. She treated her body like a machine that was malfunctioning but still operational. Ignore the warning lights. Keep the engine running. 50 feet. 100 feet. The wind picked up, pulling at her wet clothes. Below her, the base looked like a toy set. She could see the flashing lights of the patrol cars, the ants scurrying in panic. They were looking for a recruit hiding in a locker or a dumpster. They never looked up. Reaching the catwalk at the top of the tank, Elena flattened herself against the cold steel. The view was panoramic. To the west, the Pacific Ocean was a black void. To the east, the lights of San Diego shimmered. She pulled out the transmitter and the small memory card containing the photos of the doctored files and the audio notes she had recorded. She slotted the card in. The device's tiny LED blinked red. Acquiring satellite. She held it up, angling it toward the southern horizon, waiting for the handshake with a dark orbit NSA satellite that passed over this sector every 48 minutes. Come on, she thought. Watching the patrol lights below converge near the barracks. Don't make me wait. The LED turned solid green. Elena pressed the transmit button. Zip. It took less than 0.3 of a second. The encrypted packet, containing the evidence of murder, the sabotage of the O-course, and the testimony of the doctor, shot up into the vacuum of space, bounced off the satellite, and was routed instantly to a secure server in the Pentagon basement. The LED turned off. The device wiped its own memory, frying its internal circuits with a microscopic thermal charge. It was now just a piece of plastic junk. Elena slumped against the railing, exhaling a breath she felt she had been holding for weeks. The weight was gone. The kill order was out. It was no longer her word against an admiral's. It was the United States government against a rogue officer. She looked down at the chaotic base below. Sterling was down there, likely in his command center, feeling powerful as he ordered his men to hunt. He didn't know that the crosshairs had just been painted on his forehead. "Enjoy your kingdom, Admiral," she whispered to the wind. "It's about to crumble." She pocketed the dead transmitter and prepared for the descent. Getting down would be harder than going up, but for the first time in days, Elena didn't feel the pain. She felt the cold, predatory thrill of the endgame. The transition from the gritty, sweat-stained reality of the grinder to the interior of the administration building was jarring. The air conditioning was set to a sterile chill that made the sweat on Elena's uniform turn clammy against her skin. She stood at attention in front of the heavy mahogany door, waiting for the command to enter. "Enter," the voice inside commanded, smooth and detached. Elena stepped inside and marched to the center of the Persian rug, stopping 3 paces from the massive desk. She snapped a salute. "Seaman Recruit Vance, reporting as ordered, Admiral." Admiral Sterling did not look up immediately. He was signing paperwork with a fountain pen that likely cost more than a recruit's annual salary. The office smelled of lemon polish, old leather, and the lingering, sweet aroma of premium cigar smoke. It was a sanctuary of power, designed to make anyone standing on the other side of the desk feel insignificant. Sterling capped his pen and leaned back, steepling his fingers. He looked at her with a mixture of pity and distaste. "At ease, Vance. Sit down." Elena sat in the wooden chair. It was positioned slightly lower than his, forcing her to look up. "I've been reviewing your file, Elena," Sterling began, using her first name to feign a false intimacy. "You've survived Hell Week. Statistically, that is impressive. But we both know statistics don't tell the whole story." "I am here to serve, Admiral," Elena said, keeping her voice flat. "Are you?" Sterling stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the base he ruled. "I see a young woman who is lost. I see someone trying to prove a point to a world that doesn't care. And I see a tragedy waiting to happen." He turned back to her, his face hardening. "I know about your mother, Elena. The medical bills, the struggle. If you wash out now, voluntarily, I can ensure you receive a full, honorable discharge and a transition package. You can go home. Take care of her." It was a masterful lie. Her mother was a fabricated persona in the CIA database, and the medical bills were digital backstory. But Sterling didn't know that. He was attacking what he thought was her weak point: financial desperation and familial duty. "I'm not quitting, sir," Elena said. "Don't be stupid," Sterling snapped, the veneer of kindness cracking. He leaned over the desk, invading her space. "This isn't a game. This is warfare. And in warfare, the weak get people killed. You are a liability. I am trying to save you from yourself." "I met the standards, Admiral. Same as the men." "The standards?" Sterling laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "The standards are what I say they are. You think you're special. You think you're the first girl to think she can wear the trident?" He walked around the desk, stopping right next to her chair. He leaned down, whispering into her ear. "We had one last year. Rodriguez." She was just like you. Stubborn, arrogant. She thought the rules of biology didn't apply to her. Elena's heart rate remained steady, but she triggered the sensor in her back molar with her tongue. A tiny vibration confirmed the bone conduction recorder was active. "What happened to her, sir?" Elena asked, injecting a tremor of fear into her voice. "She sank," Sterling said, his voice dripping with cruel satisfaction. "The ocean took her because she didn't belong there. She drowned because she didn't know when to quit. I watched her go under, Vance, and I did nothing to stop it, because nature was correcting a mistake." "Got you," Elena thought. It was an admission of depraved indifference, if not direct murder. He had just admitted to watching a trainee drown without intervening. "I don't want to end up like her," Elena whispered, looking down at her hands. "Then ring the bell," Sterling said, straightening up and adjusting his cuffs. "Do it today, before the live fire exercise. Accidents happen on the range, Vance. It would be a shame if another mother lost a daughter." The threat was explicit. Elena stood up slowly. She looked defeated. Her shoulders slumped slightly. I need to think about it, Admiral." "You have until tomorrow morning," Sterling said, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. "Get out of my sight." Elena saluted and walked out. As the heavy door clicked shut behind her, the slump in her shoulders vanished. She walked down the hallway, the recording safely stored in the encrypted chip in her jaw. Sterling thought he had broken her spirit. He didn't realize he had just handed her the final piece of the puzzle. He had threatened her with the live fire range. She knew exactly where the next attack would come from, and this time she would shoot back. The kill house was a labyrinth of plywood walls and rubber tires designed to simulate the chaos of urban warfare. Inside, the air was stagnant, thick with the metallic taste of adrenaline and the sharp bite of cordite. For the recruits of Class 234, this was the pinnacle of trust, moving through rooms with loaded weapons, firing live 5.56mm rounds inches past their teammates' heads. "Shooter ready! Stand by!" the buzzer sounded. Elena kicked the door open. Her M4 carbine snapped tight into her shoulder. She moved with fluid precision, slicing the pie of the doorway. Threat. Eliminate. No threat. Move. Double taps echoed in the confined space, the brass casings clinking musically as they hit the concrete floor. She was paired with Davis. They moved as a unit, communicating with touch and concise verbal commands. "Moving! Covering!" They cleared the first room and stacked up on the hallway. The script called for a dynamic entry into the final hostage room. Elena took point. She checked her safety, her finger hovering along the trigger guard. High above the maze, on the catwalks meant for instructors to observe safety angles, a shadow moved. It wasn't following the flow of the team. It was stationary, positioned directly perpendicular to Elena's vector. Elena breached the room. A cardboard target popped up, a hostage taker holding a weapon. She engaged instantly. Pop, pop. Center mass. Simultaneously, a crack much louder than her own rifle erupted from above. Twang. Elena's head snapped to the right violently. A spark flew from the side of her Kevlar helmet as a high-velocity round gouged a trench through the composite material, missing her temple by less than an inch. It wasn't a ricochet. The angle was too steep. It was a direct shot from the catwalk. Time dilated. In the confused echo of the kill house, Davis thought she had tripped, but Elena knew the sound of a missed kill shot. She didn't freeze. She dropped. Gravity took her down just as a second round punched a hole in the plywood wall exactly where her throat had been a millisecond before. She rolled, using the momentum to slide behind a stack of tires meant to absorb stray rounds. "Cease fire! Cease fire! Man down!" Davis screamed, seeing Elena hit the deck. The range went silent. The smell of burnt gunpowder hung heavy in the air. Elena lay flat on her back behind the tires, her chest heaving not from fear, but from the rapid calculation of ballistics. She shifted her rifle, angling the barrel upward through a gap in the tires. She looked through her optic. There, on the catwalk, amidst the shadows of the rafters, she saw him. It wasn't Miller. It was a man she didn't recognize, wearing range safety gear but holding his rifle at a low ready, looking down with confusion. He had missed twice. He couldn't understand how a tired recruit moved faster than a trigger pull. Elena's dot settled on the man's face. The magnification of the optic showed his eyes widening. He saw her weapon pointed back at him. He saw that she wasn't dead. Her finger tightened on the trigger. The shot was clean. It would be self-defense. One round, right through his safety glasses. The solution was simple, elegant, and final. "No," a voice whispered in her head. "Not here. Not yet." If she fired, she was a highly trained operator neutralizing a threat. If she didn't, she was a lucky recruit who survived an accident. The mission came first. Elena exhaled slowly and lowered her muzzle. "Vance, Vance, talk to me!" Davis was dragging her by her vest, pulling her deeper into cover. "I'm good," Elena said, her voice raspy. She reached up and touched the gouge on her helmet. It was hot to the touch. "Ricochet. Must be a bad angle on the backstop." "Ricochet my ass," Davis hissed, looking at the hole in the wall. "That came from the roof." "Drop it, Davis," Elena ordered, gripping his arm. "It was an accident." "We clear?" The lights in the kill house flooded on fully. The catwalk door slammed shut as the shooter fled. Instructor Miller came running in, his face pale. He looked at the helmet, then at the hole in the wall. He knew. The setup had gone wrong. "Gear malfunction," Miller barked, though his voice wavered. "Everyone out, range cold, scrub the exercise." Elena stood up, dusting off her knees. She looked up at the empty catwalk one last time. Sterling had played his ace, a direct assassination attempt disguised as training, and he had failed. He had missed his shot at the devil. The Pacific Ocean was not an enemy. It was a chaotic neutral force that simply existed. But today, Admiral Sterling had tried to weaponize it. The 5-mile ocean swim was the final gate. The recruits were strung out along the coast of Coronado, black specks in the rolling gray swells. Elena was alone at the rear of the pack. She had been separated from her swim buddy, Davis, by a safety boat that had cut between them, creating a wake that pushed her further out to sea. Now, she was in the rip. The current here was a silent river moving beneath the surface, dragging everything in its path away from the safety of the shore. Elena felt the pull against her fins. She sighted the shoreline. The Hotel del Coronado was shrinking, not growing closer. She was swimming effectively, but the ocean was moving faster. She stopped kicking and treaded water, bobbing in the trough of a 6-foot swell. About 200 yards away, the safety boat idled. It wasn't coming to help. The crew on board were looking the other way, studiously ignoring the recruit drifting toward the horizon. Further out, anchoring the perimeter, was the larger command vessel, the USS Seafighter, where Sterling observed the training. He was waiting for her to panic. He was waiting for her to exhaust herself fighting the rip current, until she cramped and sank. It would be a tragic accident. Fatigue, disorientation, drowning. Elena adjusted her mask. She checked her compass board. Fighting the current was suicide, but the current wasn't pulling straight out. It had a vector. And that vector intersected directly with the sea fighter. She made a decision. She turned her back on the shore. Instead of fighting for land, she swam with the rip, angling her body to ride the invisible conveyor belt of water. Her speed doubled. She cut through the swells, a predator moving with the environment rather than against it. As she closed the distance to the command vessel, the roar of its diesel generators grew louder, masking the sound of her approach. The ship was a hulking mass of gray steel, rocking gently in the swell. Sterling would be on the bridge or the aft deck, watching the empty ocean where he expected her to die. Elena reached the stern of the ship. The water here was churned and aerated by the idle props, offering less buoyancy. She grabbed the rusted rungs of the emergency boarding ladder that extended down to the waterline. Her muscles screamed in protest. Every fiber of her body was depleted from Hell Week, but she hauled herself up, hand over hand, wet rubber on cold steel. She crested the gunwale and rolled silently onto the aft deck. She lay there for a moment, water pooling around her, her chest heaving. She stripped off her fins and mask, clipping them to her belt. She stood up. Admiral Sterling was standing at the railing on the starboard side, binoculars pressed to his eyes, scanning the distant horizon. He was alone on this deck, his back to her. "Looking for something, Admiral?" Sterling spun around. The movement was jerky, ungraceful. He lowered the binoculars, his face draining of color as if he were seeing a ghost. Elena stood 10 feet away, dripping wet, her wetsuit glistening like the skin of a seal. She wasn't out of breath anymore. She stood with the relaxed, balanced stance of someone who had just taken a morning dip, not someone who had just survived a murder attempt. "Permission to come aboard, sir," she said, her voice cutting through the wind. "The current was a bit strong. Thought I'd catch a ride back." Sterling stared at her, his mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked past her, at the ladder, then back at her face. The impossibility of the moment crushed him. She shouldn't be here. She should be at the bottom of the San Diego trough. Before he could speak, the hatch to the bridge opened. The ship's captain stepped out, holding a clipboard. "Admiral, we have the—" "Oh!" The captain stopped, seeing Elena. "Recruit Vance? We lost visual on you. Good initiative finding the boat." Sterling forced a smile. It was a rictus of hate, tight and trembling. He knew he couldn't order her thrown back in now. There were witnesses. The game of shadows was over. "Resourceful," Sterling choked out the word, it tasting like bile. "Go below, Vance. Get a towel." "Thank you, Admiral," Elena said. As she walked past him to the hatch, she didn't salute. She paused just for a second, close enough that he could smell the salt on her skin. She looked him dead in the eye, and the message was clear without a word spoken. You missed again. The transformation of the grinder was absolute. The mud, the blood, and the sand that had defined the landscape for weeks had been scrubbed away, replaced by the stark, blinding geometry of a military ceremony. Bleachers had been erected, draped in patriotic bunting. The flags of the 50 states snapped crisply in the wind against a cloudless blue sky. Elena stood in the front row of Class 234. She wore her service dress whites, the uniform stiff with starch. The high collar dug into her neck, hiding the fading bruises from the obstacle course. Her shoes were polished to a mirror shine, reflecting the black asphalt beneath. To an outsider, she looked impeccable. To a soldier, she looked dangerous, a weapon sheathed in white ceremonial silk. The order had come down 10 minutes prior. Seamen recruit Vance to post 1 pace forward of the formation. It was a calculated insult. Sterling wasn't honoring her. He was isolating her. He was putting her on a pedestal of shame, separating the real SEALs from the experiment. She stood alone, a solitary white pillar in the vast empty space between the podium and the platoon. The sun beat down on her, the heat radiating off the tarmac, but she didn't sway. She locked her knees just enough to stay upright, staring at the empty podium where the devil was about to speak. Behind her, the breathing of her classmates was a collective rhythm. She could feel their eyes on her back. A week ago, those eyes would have been filled with resentment. Now, there was something else. "Hold the line, Vance." A whisper drifted from behind her. It was barely audible, carried on the wind. It was Davis. "We're right here," another voice murmured from the left. Elena's expression didn't change, but a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the sun. Sterling had tried to sever the limb from the body, but the body was rejecting the amputation. She wasn't standing alone. She was the tip of the spear. The band struck up a march, brass instruments gleaming. The heavy oak doors of the administration building opened. Admiral Sterling emerged, flanked by his entourage of senior officers and a security detail that looked excessive for a graduation ceremony. Sterling walked to the podium. He looked immaculate, his chest heavy with ribbons that caught the light. But as he gripped the lectern, Elena saw the tension in his knuckles. They were white. He scanned the crowd, the gathered families, the press, and finally, his eyes landed on her. She was the anomaly in his perfect picture, the stain he couldn't wash out. The fact that she was standing there, alive and unbroken after the boat incident, was a direct challenge to his godhood. Sterling began his speech. It was standard rhetoric about honor, courage, and the elite nature of the brotherhood. But as he spoke, his eyes kept flickering back to Elena. The words became clipped. The cadence became aggressive. He was losing the script. "We are a warrior class," Sterling boomed, his voice echoing off the barracks walls. "We do not tolerate weakness. We do not tolerate those who cannot pull their own weight. We do not tolerate impurities." He stopped. The silence that followed was unscripted. The wind whistled through the microphone. Sterling stepped back from the microphone. He looked at the script, then crumpled the paper in his hand. He descended the stairs of the platform. A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. This wasn't part of the ceremony. The Admiral was breaking protocol. He walked onto the asphalt. His stride was long and angry. He wasn't walking toward the inspection line. He was walking directly toward Elena. His bodyguards, 4 large men in suits with earpieces, scrambled to catch up, sensing the volatility of the moment. Elena watched him come. She saw the vein pulsing in his temple. She saw the madness that comes when a narcissist is denied his victory. She shifted her weight imperceptibly to the balls of her feet. The distance closed. 50 feet, 20 feet. 10. Sterling stopped directly in front of her, invading her personal space, violating every rule of military decorum. The smell of his cologne was overpowering, mixed with the sour scent of old coffee. He loomed over her, blocking out the sun. "You think you won," Sterling whispered, his voice trembling with rage, too low for the crowd to hear, but loud enough for the microphone on the podium to catch a distorted rumble. "You think surviving makes you one of us." Elena looked up, her face a mask of stone. The time for hiding was over. The investigation was done. The evidence was sent. Now there was only the reckoning. "I didn't just survive, Admiral," she said, her voice clear and steady. "I took notes." The silence on the parade deck was absolute, heavy with the salt-thick air of Coronado and the crushing heat of the midday sun. 300 sailors stood at rigid attention, their white uniforms blindingly bright, but every eye was locked on the confrontation happening front and center. Admiral Sterling stood inches from Elena's face. The veins in his neck were distended, pulsing with a dangerous, erratic rhythm. He moved with the slow, predatory gait of a man who believed he owned the very oxygen in the perimeter. But Elena saw the truth behind his eyes. Fear. He was a cornered animal trying to roar his way out of a trap. "You think you belong here?" Sterling's voice was a low growl, barely audible to the formation but thundering in her ears. "You are a clerical error, a waste of my budget and a stain on my trident." Elena did not blink. She knew exactly what he was doing. He was trying to provoke her into a court-martial offense before the investigation could touch him. He wanted her to shove him. He needed a reason to arrest her. "I am standing, Admiral," she replied, her voice cool and detached. "That is all the regulations require." The mention of regulations snapped the last thread of Sterling's control. He leaned in, invading her personal space, the smell of expensive cologne mixing with the stale odor of his coffee breath. "Regulations. I am the regulation." He reached out and grabbed the National Defense Service medal pinned to her chest, a generic commendation she had just been handed. With a violent jerk, he ripped it from her uniform. The pin tore the white fabric. He threw the medal on the ground, the metal clinking sharply against the asphalt. When she remained like a statue, staring through him rather than at him, the insult to his authority made him snap. His hand came up, fast and heavy, a backhand slap designed not just to hurt, but to humiliate. Thwack. The sound echoed off the concrete barracks like a gunshot. Elena's head turned slightly to the left. A collective gasp rippled through the formation behind her. Assaulting a subordinate was the end of a career, but Sterling felt untouchable. He raised his hand again, trembling with the desire to strike harder. "Pick it up," Sterling hissed, "and then get out of my—" The air shifted. The pressure dropped. Elena's head turned back to center. The mask of Seaman Recruit Vance dissolved. The eyes that met Sterling's were ancient and terrifying. They were the eyes of the Wraith. In that fraction of a second, Elena analyzed the threat matrix. 4 bodyguards closing in from the periphery, distance 15 feet. Sterling, open stance, weight forward, chin exposed. She didn't need a plan. Muscle memory took over. Elena stepped inside Sterling's guard. It was a movement so fast it blurred the edges of reality. She didn't wind up. She generated torque from her hips, driving her fist upward in a compact, kinetic chain. Her knuckles connected with the point of Sterling's chin. It wasn't a brawl. It was physics applied with surgical precision. The impact snapped Sterling's head back, shutting off the electrical signals in his brainstem instantly. His eyes rolled back into his head. His knees folded. He didn't stumble. He collapsed. The Admiral hit the deck with the heavy, wet sound of dead weight, unconscious before his cap even hit the ground. "Hostile down!" one of the bodyguards shouted, his hand diving for the pistol inside his jacket as he sprinted forward. "Don't," Elena said. She didn't shout. She didn't raise her voice. She simply held up one hand, palm out, while standing over the fallen body of the Admiral. The command carried the weight of absolute lethality. The lead bodyguard froze. He looked at the unconscious admiral, then at the small woman in the torn white uniform. He saw her stance, balanced, relaxed, ready. He saw the way she tracked his center of mass. His training told him that if he drew his weapon, he would be dead before he cleared the holster. The silence that returned to the grinder was different now. It wasn't the silence of discipline. It was the silence of awe. Elena looked down at Sterling. He was breathing, a shallow, snoring rattle. She adjusted her collar, covering the tear in the fabric. "Class 234, Elena called out, not looking back. "Dismissed." She turned and walked toward the stunned bodyguards, her hands open and empty. "Call the MPs," she told the lead agent calmly, "and tell them to bring handcuffs. For him." The wail of sirens pierced the stunned silence of the parade deck. Military police cruisers screeched onto the tarmac, their lights flashing red and blue against the stark white of the dress uniforms. Doors flew open, and MPs poured out, weapons drawn, uncertain of who the enemy was in a formation of unarmed sailors. "On the ground! Everyone on the ground!" The bodyguards, confused and leaderless, stepped back from the fallen admiral, raising their hands. They looked at Elena, expecting her to run or fight. Instead, she stood perfectly still, her hands clasped behind her back in a parade rest position, looking at the approaching chaos with mild disinterest. Before the first MP could reach her, a convoy of 3 black suburban SUVs tore through the base gates, bypassing the security checkpoint. They didn't have sirens. They had authority. They skidded to a halt between the MPs and Elena, forming a physical wall of steel. The doors opened. Men in dark suits and tactical gear stepped out. They didn't shout. They simply held up badges that made the MP shift commander pale and holster his weapon immediately. From the middle vehicle, a man with silver hair and a suit that cost more than the admiral's car stepped out. He walked past the MPs, past the nervous bodyguards, and stopped in front of Elena. He didn't salute. He nodded. "Status, Agent Vance?" the man asked. "Target neutralized, Director," Elena replied, her voice calm. "Evidence package was delivered via satellite 40 minutes ago. The chain of custody is secure." On the ground, Admiral Sterling groaned. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and glassy. He tried to push himself up, but his equilibrium was shattered. He spat blood onto the pristine asphalt. "Arrest her," Sterling slurred, his jaw moving painfully. "She assaulted a superior officer. I want her court-martialed." The director looked down at Sterling with the kind of look one gives to roadkill. He signaled to 2 of his agents. They didn't help Sterling up gently. They hauled him to his feet, pulling his arms behind his back. The click of handcuffs was loud and final. "Admiral Sterling," the director said, his voice carrying over the wind. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit murder, falsification of government records, and gross negligence leading to the death of a service member. You are being stripped of command, effective immediately." Sterling blinked, the reality crashing down through the concussion fog. "You can't do this. Do you know who I am? I run this base." "Not anymore," the director said. "Now, you're just a suspect." Elena stepped forward. The agents holding Sterling paused, allowing her one final moment. She looked at the man who had tried to drown her, break her, and kill her. He looked small now, stripped of his power, just an old man with a glass jaw and a broken ego. She leaned in close, so only he could hear. "You were right about one thing, Sterling," she whispered. "I wasn't a recruit. I'm the consequence. Sterling's eyes went wide with realization. He hadn't been fighting a subordinate. He had been fighting a ghost sent by the very system he thought protected him. They dragged him away, stuffing him into the back of a secure van. The formation of sailors watched in silence as their tyrant was removed like common trash. "We have a transport ready for you, Elena," the director said, gesturing to the lead SUV. "New mission profile is already being uploaded. You're needed in Yemen." Elena looked at the open door of the SUV, then back at Class 234. Davis was standing in the front row, his mouth slightly open. She caught his eye and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. It wasn't a goodbye. It was an acknowledgement. "Hold the line." "I'll find my own way, sir," Elena said. "I need to walk for a bit." The director studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Don't be late." The convoy departed, taking the noise and the drama with it. The MPs began to disperse the formation, shouting orders to get everyone back to the barracks. Elena walked toward the main gate. She didn't look back at the grinder or the obstacle course tower or the ocean that had tried to swallow her. She adjusted the strap of her duffel bag on her shoulder. Her uniform was torn, her knuckles were bruised, and she was technically no longer in the Navy. She was Elena Vance. She was the Wraith. She was the hero who would never get a medal, whose name would be scrubbed from the roster by tomorrow morning. As she passed through the gates, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the road. A cool breeze rolled in off the Pacific. She took a deep breath, tasting the salt air one last time. The mission was done. The ghost faded back into the dark,